Imagine this. You've done everything you were told would make you happy. You've chased the degree, the job, the relationship, the house. You've been disciplined. You've played by the rules. You've smiled on cue. You've buried your questions beneath busy schedules and shallow affirmations. On paper, you've built a life. But in the mirror, something doesn't fit. And now, one morning around age 37, maybe 41, maybe precisely on your 40th birthday, you wake up and something has shifted. Not in your surroundings, but in the air inside your chest. There's a kind of silence there that wasn't there before. A hollowness behind your ambitions. A strange ache that's hard to name. You've lived long enough to see your goals fulfilled, and still feel strangely unsatisfied. You've loved and lost. You've betrayed yourself in small ways. Compromises here, silences there. You've smiled when you wanted to scream. You've stayed when your soul was begging you to run. And now, you're asking a question you didn't know how to ask at 25. What the hell was all that for? This is not depression. This is not a breakdown. This is awakening. The slow, cracking realization that the first half of your life may have been built on a script that was never truly yours. Carl Jung called this the turning point, the place where the ego begins to fracture. Not because it's failing, but because the soul is finally ready to emerge. Before 40, Jung suggested, we live out what he called the first phase of life, a time focused on identity, status, ambition, external validation. The task in that phase is to become someone, a role, a persona, a mask the world approves of. But at midlife, something begins to shift, slowly, uncomfortably, inexorably. The persona no longer satisfies. The roles feel empty. The job feels mechanical. Even the things you love begin to feel like echoes of a self that no longer exists. And here's the paradox. From the outside, this shift makes no sense. You may have everything you thought you wanted. You may be more successful than ever. You may appear calm, stable, wise. But internally, it feels like the ground is shaking. And you can't explain it to anyone because you can barely explain it to yourself. So you wonder, is this burnout? Is this regret? Is this the beginning of decline? Or is it something else entirely? What if this moment, this discomfort, this confusion, this collapse is not the end, but the beginning? What if nothing was meant to make sense before now, because your life until this point wasn't yours to understand? What if, as Carl Jung believed, your real life doesn't even begin until the ego starts to fall apart? What if everything up to this point has been the construction of a shell, and now, at last, it's time to break it? And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people never do. They double down on the familiar. They medicate the symptoms. They distract with new goals. They call the ache midlife crisis and try to silence it with noise. But those who listen really listen to that still, quiet ache. They step into something far more terrifying and far more beautiful. They begin the descent inward. They begin to meet the self behind the mask. They begin, finally, to live. Because the greatest tragedy is not death. The greatest tragedy is reaching the halfway point of life and realizing you've never actually met yourself. So the question becomes, what if everything you've called you was just a rehearsal? And what if this pain is the invitation to finally begin? We're going there next. And once you understand what Jung really meant about life beginning at 40, you'll see your entire past, every choice, every pattern, every crack, not as failure, but as preparation. The kind of preparation only a soul can understand. What if the reason nothing made sense before 40 is because it wasn't supposed to? Carl Jung believed the human psyche develops in stages. And the first half of life, what he called the development of the persona, isn't built for meaning. It's built for survival, for identity, for structure, for establishing a place in society. It's a necessary illusion. A mask we wear to navigate the external world. The problem isn't the persona. The problem is mistaking it for the self. In your younger years, you are consumed with becoming someone. You learn to adapt, to succeed, to be desirable. You learn what pleases your parents, impresses your peers, earns praise in school, and wins love in relationships. But beneath it all, you're shape-shifting. You begin to believe that your worth is conditional, that love must be earned, that success will give you meaning, that validation will finally make you feel whole. And here's where it gets more insidious. You start to call this adaptation growth. You look at your curated identity and say, this is me, but it's not fully. It's a persona, a construction, a defense mechanism forged in childhood, reinforced by culture, and worshipped by modern society. Carl Jung called this early self the little self, or ego identity. It's not evil, it's just incomplete, because it is based on fragmentation. To become socially acceptable, you had to suppress the unacceptable parts of you, the anger, the wildness, the hunger, the grief, the vulnerability. You locked them away in your unconscious mind, and they didn't die. They simply went dark. Jung called this your shadow, everything you are that you were taught not to be. And here's where the hidden problem begins to take shape. As you build the first half of your life, the more you succeed in the external world, the further you often drift from your inner one. You might be admired, but you feel hollow. You might be accomplished, but you feel fake. You might have everything, and yet feel like nothing is truly yours. Why? Because the life you built wasn't born from your soul. It was built on avoiding it. Jung wasn't alone in this insight. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us too. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But what if you never asked why? What if all your hows were inherited, copied, performed? Arthur Schopenhauer, who deeply influenced Jung, believed that human suffering comes from desire, especially desires we never consciously choose. He saw people as constantly chasing illusions, enslaved by will, distracted by appearances. And Jung took that further by showing how this chasing is not just philosophical, it's psychological programming. You were taught to pursue success, but never taught to define your values. You were told to find love, but never shown how to know yourself. You were told to be good, but never allowed to feel whole. And so you built a castle of sand, polished, impressive, applauded. But beneath the surface, beneath the bank account, the marriage, the followers, the diploma is a silent question you never dared to ask. Who am I? When I'm no longer becoming who others need me to be? This question waits in the shadows. And for most people, it doesn't rise until the structures begin to collapse. Midlife is when that collapse often begins not externally, but internally. And it isn't always dramatic. It can be subtle, like a slow erosion of clarity. Like waking up one day and realizing you no longer recognize your own reflection, not because it looks different, but because it no longer feels real. Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith, living in denial of your own freedom by conforming to roles. And Carl Jung went deeper. He called it spiritual death, when the persona consumes the soul. This is why nothing makes sense before 40, because until this point, you are never taught to look inward. You are only taught to perform, to belong, to impress, to achieve. But at midlife, the soul begins to speak, quietly at first, then more urgently, through dreams, discomfort, inexplicable fatigue, dissatisfaction that no vacation or promotion can fix. Your unconscious repressed for decades starts to leak through the seams of your life. And if you're willing to listen, it will take you somewhere terrifying and beautiful. Because here's what Carl Jung ultimately revealed. The task of the first half of life is to build a strong ego. But the task of the second half is to dismantle it. Not to destroy yourself, but to finally become yourself. This is individuation, a painful, sacred process of reuniting with all the parts you left behind, the ones you buried to survive, the ones you silenced to be liked, the ones you lost in the pursuit of being good. At midlife, the self doesn't whisper anymore. It demands to be seen, not as an ideal, not as a role, but as a wholeness that includes it all: your darkness, your contradictions, your hunger for more, your desire to be real at last. So no, nothing made sense before 40, because before 40, you weren't supposed to make sense. You were supposed to build the ego, test its limits, and discover sometimes painfully that it's not enough. The real journey begins now. The question is, will you take it? Or will you retreat back into the safety of your mask? The next part of the journey reveals what happens when you don't listen, when you stay in the persona too long, when the mask becomes your prison, because the consequences aren't loud. They're subtle, and that makes them even more dangerous. We go there next. Most people don't notice when they begin to disappear. There's no alarm, no dramatic collapse, no public unraveling, just a slow fade barely perceptible at first. You keep going through the motions. You laugh at the right times. You meet your deadlines. You stay productive. You scroll past your feelings. You become efficient and empty. Carl Jung warned us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And here lies the greatest danger of all: not failure, not loss, not humiliation, but a life so carefully constructed, so well behaved, so convincingly successful, that it quietly buries the soul beneath comfort, distraction, and performance. When you ignore the voice that begins to whisper at midlife, it doesn't go away. It just changes form. And the longer you deny it, the more it seeps into your daily life, not as clarity, but as confusion. The consequences are subtle, but they are everywhere. You begin to feel exhausted, not from work, but from pretending. You can't focus, not because you lack discipline, but because your life no longer feels aligned with anything meaningful. You lose interest in what once lit you up, not because you're lazy, but because your soul is tired of waiting. You keep repeating the same arguments, dating the same people in different bodies, getting the same promotions that feel increasingly hollow. And still, you push forward because the alternative feels scarier than the numbness you've learned to live with. This is the unseen trap, the slow death of authenticity masked as stability. Your persona, the mask you built to survive, becomes the jailer of your becoming. And you can't even tell you're imprisoned because the world is applauding your cage. But the unconscious is relentless. It does not forget what you've buried. The shadow waits, and it begins to leak. It leaks through sudden anger that seems out of place, through anxiety that appears in calm moments, through inexplicable sadness that rises when you should be happy, through impulsive decisions that defy logic, through a yearning you can't explain, a longing for something more, even if you don't know what that more is. And this is where most people panic. They call it a midlife crisis. They buy the car, end the marriage, change careers, join retreats, move cities, start over. But these are just surface solutions to a deeper ache, the ache of a life lived externally, while the inner world starved in silence. You see, the problem isn't aging, it's awakening. And our culture has no language for awakening. It tells you to stay positive, to keep achieving, to reinvent yourself. It never tells you to stop, to sit in the discomfort, to listen, because silence is where the persona begins to die. And that death, though sacred, is terrifying. Neurologically, the brain resists stillness. It craves patterns, certainty, momentum. That's why habits are hard to break, even toxic ones. It's safer to repeat dysfunction than risk the unknown. The ego thrives in the familiar, even if the familiar is making you miserable. So we self-soothe, we rationalize. We distract. We fill the silence with screens. We fill the loneliness with noise. We fill the emptiness with busyness. But no amount of productivity can quiet a soul screening to be seen. This is where Carl Jung's work becomes not just relevant, but revolutionary. He believed that repression breeds illness, not just psychological, but spiritual. When we suppress our inner truth, the psyche compensates. It sends messages, in dreams, in symptoms, in strange synchronicities, in repeated life patterns that seem to have no origin, but always end the same way. And if you ignore these messages, the consequences deepen. You become cynical, mistaking numbness for wisdom. You become bitter, confusing fatigue with realism. You become rigid, calling it discipline, but living in fear of change. You become detached, not enlightened, just dissociated. All while telling yourself, I'm fine, but you're not fine. You're functioning. There's a difference. Fine is alive. Functioning is survival. Fine is presence. Functioning is performance. Fine is truth. Functioning is denial wrapped in routine. The tragedy is this. Many people never realize they've been functioning their entire lives. They die with their masks still on. Because facing the truth takes more courage than success ever did. It requires burning down the persona. It requires grieving the life you built while asleep. It requires admitting, I don't know who I am anymore. But only then can something new emerge. Something real. Something rooted. Something that can finally breathe. Because the greatest consequence of avoiding the soul is never knowing what it means to truly live from it. So here you are, midlife, on the edge of something raw and real, with a choice to make. You can numb the ache, or you can let it guide you. You can repeat the old patterns, or you can step into the mystery of who you've never dared to become. The next part of this journey isn't about repair. It's about reclaiming. It's about rebellion, not against the world, but against the false self you are told to become. And that's what we're stepping into next. Because freedom doesn't come from running toward more. It comes from finally stopping and turning inward. There is a moment when silence becomes louder than any noise you've ever known. A moment when the life you've built begins to feel like a costume. It still fits, but it itches in places you never noticed before. You find yourself surrounded by people who know your name, but no longer know your soul. You check all the right boxes, but feel more like a memory than a person. This is the moment the rebellion begins, not as a declaration of war, but as a quiet refusal. A refusal to keep lying to yourself. A refusal to keep smiling through spiritual suffocation. A refusal to keep performing a version of you that was never real to begin with. Carl Jung understood that the second half of life requires something the first half never prepared you for. Surrender. Not to weakness, not to despair, but to truth, to shadow, to the vast, terrifying space inside you where everything repressed, ignored, and denied waits to be seen. He called it individuation, but this word does not do justice to the fire it takes. Because to become whole, you must be willing to break everything you've built in order to survive. This rebellion is not loud. It doesn't post itself on social media. It doesn't need applause. It starts with a decision so small you might miss it. You wake up and choose not to numb yourself today. You pause instead of pretending. You cry instead of explaining. You say no, not out of defiance, but because your body said no first, and this time you listened. These are the beginnings of freedom. They look like stillness, but they are seismic shifts. You've spent decades becoming someone impressive, reliable, good, smart. But Jung warned, what you repress does not die. It lives in the shadow, and the shadow, if ignored, will live your life for you. It will choose your lovers. It will sabotage your peace. It will leak out in passive aggression, in anxiety, in burnout. So to rebel, you must retrieve the parts of you exiled, the wildness, the anger, the joy, the need, the truth you whispered in the dark, but never said out loud. You must gather these fragments not to be fixed, but to be felt. This is not self-help. This is self-confrontation. The rebellion begins the moment you realize that you do not need to become someone else. You need to stop betraying who you already are. No more contorting. No more shrinking to fit into someone else's story. No more sedating your authenticity to make others comfortable. There will be loss. There will be grief. But there will also be something else, something holy. The moment you choose your truth over your image, you will begin to breathe differently. Slower, deeper, real. To break free is to let go of the myth that healing looks like constant growth. Sometimes it looks like collapse, like rest, like saying, I don't know who I am anymore, and realizing that's the most honest thing you've said in years. Jung taught that real change doesn't come from the ego. It comes from the death of the ego. That death doesn't look like drama. It looks like the quiet shedding of false selves. It looks like losing interest in things that once defined you. It looks like sitting in a room with your pain and not running from it this time. This rebellion is not about proving anything. It's about returning. Returning to the self you were before the world named you. Returning to your intuition, your chaos, your stillness. It will make people uncomfortable. That's how you know it's working. Because the more you return to your truth, the less you will tolerate what once passed for love. You will stop negotiating with your boundaries. You will stop apologizing for your existence. You will no longer dim your light to soothe someone else's fear of their own. This is not a rebellion of rage. It's a rebellion of alignment. You stop chasing things that are killing you. You stop hiding parts of yourself that are sacred. You stop asking for permission to be whole. There's no blueprint for this. No 10-step plan. Because what you are becoming has never existed before. You are not becoming a better version of your false self. You are becoming you, fully, for the first time. And that means letting the old life burn. It means grieving the stories that sustained you, but no longer serve you. It means allowing yourself to not know what comes next, and trusting that your soul does. It means realizing that the self you are seeking has been seeking you all along. Not in success, not in perfection, but in the moments you felt most lost, most broken, most real. This rebellion is terrifying. It should be, because it means you are stepping into the unknown without a mask. But the alternative, continuing to betray yourself for the comfort of others, is a far greater loss. The world will try to pull you back. It will say, be who you were. But once you've tasted the truth, you can't forget it. You can't unsee your soul. You can't unhear the quiet voice that said, you were made for more than this. You were, and now you remember. The final realization is near, and it is not a destination. It is a homecoming. You've spent a lifetime searching for something. And what if the search ends when you stop looking outward? What if the life that makes sense, the one you've been aching for, has been inside you, buried beneath expectations all along? You're not breaking down. You're breaking open. Keep going. There's a moment that comes when you've stopped trying to fix yourself, when the performance ends, when the striving quiets, when all the roles you played collapse at your feet, and instead of scrambling to rebuild them, you sit in the ashes, not out of defeat, but reverence, because something in you knows the fire wasn't a failure. It was sacred. Carl Jung understood something most people never dare to accept, that the self is not something you find, but something that emerges when you no longer need to hide. That the second half of life doesn't begin when you add more success, more control, more answers. It begins when you stop running from your own depth, when you let the mask fall, when you finally, honestly ask, what's left when I'm no longer trying to be anything? What's left is the self, not the self with a lowercase, this, not the ego, Not the performer, not the projection, but the self with a capital S. The one that has been quietly waiting for you beneath the noise of your achievements, beneath the armor of your persona, beneath the shame you inherited, beneath the lies you told yourself just to keep moving forward. This self is not a concept. It's a reality, a felt presence, an inner home that cannot be faked or manufactured. It doesn't care about your resume. It doesn't want applause. It only wants wholeness. And to reach it, you must pass through the one thing most people avoid their entire lives. Truth. The truth that your worth is not conditional. The truth that no external validation will ever heal an internal abandonment. The truth that everything you were taught to become was just a rehearsal for remembering who you already were. This is the paradox Jung saw so clearly, that we must spend the first half of life building up the ego only, so that we can deconstruct it in the second half. That we must wear the mask long enough to recognize how heavy it is. That we must chase the illusion long enough to realize that meaning was never out there. It was always within. So what is the ultimate truth? It's this: you are already whole. Not when you're healed, not when you're successful, not when everyone understands you. Now, here, in this imperfect, uncertain, wildly alive moment, the self is not a goal. It's not a mountain you climb. It's the ground you return to when you stop running, and the moment you stop resisting what you are. You become it, not by force, but by surrender. Not by doing more, but by being deeply, fiercely honest with yourself. This is what midlife offers: not decline, but initiation. Not despair, but rebirth. A chance to shed the life you were told to want, and finally build one rooted in truth, in presence, in soul. You don't need to know the whole path. You just need to take the next true step. Maybe that means setting a boundary. Maybe it means grieving what you outgrew. Maybe it means creating something for the joy of it. Maybe it means sitting still long enough to feel what you've been avoiding for years. Whatever it is, trust it. Because the self does not speak in logic. It speaks in resonance. You'll feel it in your body before you understand it in your mind. A soft yes, a grounded no. A rising energy that says, this is mine. This is real. This is me. And once you touch that truth, even for a moment, everything changes. The world may stay the same, but you won't. You'll stop performing in rooms that don't see you. You'll stop begging for permission to be whole. You'll stop fearing the unknown and start welcoming it as the only place where something new can be born. This is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of one that's finally yours. Not the life you are conditioned to live. Not the one you built to be accepted, but the one that arises from your essence, raw, real, radiant. Nothing made sense before now, because before now, you were living someone else's dream. Now you're waking up, and when you do, you'll remember that the self was never far away. It was here all along, quiet, steady, waiting for you to finally come home. Welcome back. If this awakens something in you, hit like, subscribe, and share. Your real life starts now.